We're here to increase our collective understanding of how great cities are shaped. We believe everyone has a role to play in urban design. This is a space where we can learn from international examples and discuss issues relating to built form, the distinctiveness of cities, and how we feel connected to place. We can be curious and open-minded. We can all learn and grow. So, let's get to it, Geelong.
So the format of the webinar today will be two 10-minute presentations by our guest speakers, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. So please feel free to post questions in the chat during the talks. This is an educational webinar series, so the focus of the questions should be on improving our understanding of urban design. The questions will be moderated, and to let you know that this session is being recorded. So today's topic is place and the role of placemaking. And to address this important topic, we've got two experts speaking about sense of place, belonging, and how they shape the spaces in our cities. Our first speaker is Dr. Emily Potter. Emily is an associate professor in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University. Her research concerns the practices through which communities make place and negotiate a sense of belonging, with a particular focus on the role of stories told in and about these places. Her current projects include a study of the community impacts of the Wimmera Mallee Silo Art Trail and a regional literary history project also based in the Mallee, which draws on reader participation to generate diverse stories of place. Emily is also the author of Writing Belonging at the Millennium, Notes from the Field of Settler Colonial Place. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll just share my screen. Thanks again, and hello, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge that I am talking to you today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations here in Melbourne, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I also pay my respects to the Wadawurrung people, and I'm grateful for Nikki Mackenzie's generous welcome to her country. I'd like to thank Jonathan and his team in the City of Geelong for the invitation to speak to you on a topic that has long fascinated me, and that is the question of how we make the places that we live in and the implications of that placemaking for the possibilities of diverse, resilient and nurturing communities. A moment ago, when I paid my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, I acknowledged the continuity of Indigenous occupation and sovereignty in this country, in which past, present and future are of equal concern. From my outsider stance as a non-Indigenous Australian, I'm aware that from an Indigenous standpoint, time is not a forward-focused line. For Indigenous people, ancestors who inhabit the present lead the way back to the future. While the more prevalent understanding of time in our dominant culture is linear, this emphasis on the past's ongoing role in the active making of the future is the thread that I want to follow here today. We do not necessarily make good futures or places by leaving the past behind. So I'm interested, as I've said, in how places are made. And by this, I don't just mean the materials used or the theories of design that guide placemaking. What I want to talk to you about, and what I mean, is the making of places and the future of our places through the narratives or stories that we tell in and about them. My research focuses on how places come into being through a network of stories across time and the histories that are licensed to be told and encountered in the making of place. By stories, I mean narrative expressions that model or recount ways of seeing and understanding the world and its happenings. Stories manifest our imaginaries, and as the philosopher Helen Verron contends in a point that I find very instructive, imaginaries are not located in minds. They manifest constantly in our material making and inhabitation of the world. They provide form to our actions and designs. From this perspective, the spaces in which we dwell and make our lives are already shaped through the narratives we live by. The infrastructure that supports our everyday lives recounts and reinforces place stories. As Jonathan indicated, my research focuses in the communities of the Wimmera and Mallee regions of Victoria, communities in which agriculture has been central to people's lives for almost 2 centuries. These places are correspondingly dominated by narratives of agriculture in the visual iconography of towns, for instance, so in public murals, street or business names, visitor communication or memorials, and in the material infrastructure of the place, so the dominating grain silos, train lines, and in the town streetscape and civic amenities planned and built around these. While the agricultural identity of these towns undoubtedly has reflected the significance of this industry to its community, economically and socially, it has also had an imaginative function. Euphemistically cleared lands dispossessed of traditional owners were justified through stories of lands put to use, of economic industry transforming this country into an asset in Western commodity terms through the hard work of labouring the land. Now, this is not at all to detract from the real labour of generations of agricultural communities in the making of Australia today, but rather to indicate the collective imaginative work that goes alongside that. Nor is this just a matter for regional Australia. Contemporary cities have their own dominant place stories, perhaps most clearly evidenced in the extreme linearity of their design. Their concreted, fast-moving streets privilege the able body of city workers on the clock. The disruption of homeless bodies on the street, or the city that shuts down for public protest, indicates that the normative reality accommodated by our urban design privileges a certain vision of order and efficiency. So just to return to regional Victoria now, what happens when a dominant place story begins to separate from the reality of that place? I started working in the Wimmera Mallee in the mid-2000s when the economic decline of many of these communities was well in evidence. Falling populations and empty shop fronts were indicative of big shifts in the organisation of agriculture in the latter part of the 20th century as small-scale family-run farms began to give way to massified corporation-owned land holdings. And as a result, less and less people were directly involved in agricultural production. The railway lines that had been a vital lifeline between communities shut down or services cut back. How can people find their sense of belonging in a place that offers limited stories for alternative futures when that place has radically changed? There needs to be other stories on offer. And I don't mean that we need to make up new ones. A wealth of stories is already there. The connection between storytelling and placemaking that I am talking about is also one that is central to Indigenous knowledge. As the award-winning author and one-year elder Alexis Wright has written, I am acutely aware while visiting other places that I am in the home of the ancestors whose stories since ancient times are preserved in the land, seas, skies, and atmosphere. The stories of ancestors continue to, quote, knit the threads within the larger fabric of the world, as Indigenous Canadian scholar D'Oliveira Andriotti writes. These are not the only stories in place, even while they, of course, endure. In colonised countries such as Australia and Canada, countries with centuries of multicultural migration that shape their populations today, there are many other stories that track across our places. Stories of comings and goings, stories of meetings, of individual and collective experience. Our world is dense with stories. However, our habits of placemaking often work against acknowledging this, enabling a single story to prevail over the possibility of others. The Wimmera Mallee is responding to the challenges it faces with efforts to rejuvenate its economic future through tourism. The Silo Art Trail, located in the Shire of Yarriambiack, has been a major investment in placemaking for the region, and many of you have no doubt heard of or even visited the trail itself. I was part of a team commissioned by Creative Victoria, a key funder of the trail, to study its economic impact for the towns it encompasses, all of them small agricultural communities. The trail was established in 2016 in a partnership with Yarriambiack, Creative Victoria and Graham Corp, who owns many of the silos that still flank the entry to all these towns today. The silos used were mostly decommissioned, Each was painted with a distinct large-scale image by a well-known street artist over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, and notably none of these artists came from the region. On each occasion, the artist stayed in or near the town, mingling with locals at the pub at night, and something which we anecdotally heard fed into the artist's understanding of the place and in turn informed their artworks. To this extent, we could say that these silo murals were not imposed from the outside, but they emerged in an environment of exchange and situated experience on the part of the artist and community. The silos have been a success from several perspectives. The Silo Art Trail, while not the first example of silo art in Australia or the world, has become a template for regional public art around Australia, and the popularity of large-scale painting of defunct industrial infrastructure has skyrocketed as a response to the challenges of communities in transition. In the Wimmera Mallee, tourism has undoubtedly increased, and the economic advantages of this are clear. Tourist infrastructure has expanded, accommodation, bus tours, cafes, local stores and pubs. Several pubs have reopened, powered by collective models of ownership, community models of ownership, meaning that renewed approaches to economic organisation are also a result of the Silo Art Trail. These are examples of how public art-led placemaking can have significant effects for communities. At the same time, I have wondered about the capacity of these works to remake place at a narrative level. While positive impacts of the trail are evident, what kind of futures are being licensed by the Silo Art Trail as a series of stories of this place? Does it expand the identity of this region, and in doing so acknowledge the breadth of its community, both past and present, and encourage diversified futures, which for me is a key question of placemaking? My questions relate to the stories told through the silo imagery itself, which largely continue to rehearse the same stories of place that have dominated here, focused on non-Indigenous community figures and redolent with agricultural reference. One silo in Sheep's Hill is an exception and depicts Wagaya and Watchabollock community and elders and members. Despite this, the normalising influence of majority agricultural imagery has meant that subsequent silo art around Victoria and elsewhere in Australia routinely draws on settler colonial icons of farming life, as well as local wildlife and flora. What is the impact of this? I would say that positive economic impacts do not necessarily translate to placemaking that prioritises social and cultural goals. But I would also say that economic impact is ultimately constrained by the capacity of a place to really reimagine its future. As the design theorist Tony Fry aptly states, designed things go on designing. That is, designs on place actively shape the lives we inhabit. They have a crucial and determining role in the future. The Wimmera Mallees is not a straightforward story of non-Indigenous agricultural endeavour. It is also constituted of stories tens of thousands of years old, as well as stories of many others who have visited, traversed, settled here, and continue to do so, from Chinese miners walking from Adelaide to the Ballarat goldfields, or Sikh hawkers moving between towns selling their wares, to recently arrived migrants from West Africa. The implication of dominant place stories that rehearse long-standing ideas of a place is that they exclude other kinds of belonging, forged through different narratives, and they prescribe futures too. To work against this, I think, we need placemaking practices that resist a future already imagined, enabling communities to tell their own stories through an openness to who we have been, as well as what we might become. And thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Before we move on to, or while Vanessa's getting set up for the next presentation, I've got a question for you. In your talk, you focus quite a lot, I think, on this, maybe a sense of being out of place, or people in the community that maybe feel out of place. Could you talk a little bit about some of the, as a researcher, some of the methods that you use to understand that sense of feeling out of place?
That's a great question. I think, it's talking to people. Clearly, we made a point of talking to community leaders as part of this project, but also to people who are involved at a day-to-day level in running these communities, essentially people who work in the businesses or keep everything going. And it's in those sort of those anecdotes that people provide about their sense of place and belonging that I found I often encountered that tension of a commitment to being in that place and a desire for it to flourish, but a feeling that things were just that there was something that was dissonant there. That I mean, and I would say with my kind of language that I'm using here, a story that wasn't quite right, that wasn't sitting quite well, and that the day-to-day experience of these people was in almost a sort of a different version of that place. And so until you have kind of designs that can accommodate that fluidity, I think you're going to have people who are alienated in spaces, in common spaces, and in communities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. I think we're getting set up for the next speaker. So our next speaker is Vanessa Walker. Vanessa is a placemaker and champion of civic life in cities. She trained in architecture and planning, specialising very early on in her career in public art. She established Federation Square's public venues and events programs, and then joined the Victorian Government's Development Agency to lead community and cultural infrastructure development. Vanessa works with developers and communities on early planning and design, as well as place management and activation. And she's a member of the Victorian Design Review Panel and is actively involved in projects in her community. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Now, can you see my screen?
I think we can see your desktop at the moment. Oh, now we've got it. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Nikki McKenzie for her welcome and acknowledge that the Wadawurrung traditional owners of Geelong. I'm very aware that of the injustices of the past. We have a lot to learn from our traditional owners about the places we live and work in. Just getting set up. Just today, I'm going to just very briefly outline a few points for placemaking, assuming not everyone knows a lot about it. So I'll just make a bit of a definition and then talk about some of the positive outcomes that can come to communities and places locally, and some of the ways that we can all work as placemakers to create better places. So what is placemaking? It's something that we have been doing for a very long time, of course, millennia really, and it's something that really most of the time throughout our history as human communities, we've been doing it pretty naturally and organically. So it's been communities who've been making places, but particularly shared places for communing, for gathering, for exchanging, you know, places also for bathing, for worship, for education, transportation, for exaltation. So for over many generations, places have evolved traditionally, and they've been places that reflect the values and aspirations of their communities. Many of these places are cherished by people around the world today, but there are also places, of course, that are just cherished by people in their neighbourhood. More recently, particularly last century, things changed quite a bit, particularly, you know, in Western countries, where a lot of the changes to cities and places that was happening, you know, did not enable community life and did not enable people to participate in that shaping or to flourish really in those places. So the development of freeways, of high-rise development, of single-use development and very large-scale development, for example, was quite dehumanising. And particularly in the middle of the century, in the 60s and 70s, people began to push back about this, particularly activists and theorists in the United States, where it was happening quite a lot. And we've learned from this, and this was the beginning of the term placemaking as we know it. In more recent times, we still have issues to deal with in our cities, but placemaking has grown to be more of a communal, sort of a global movement, with individuals and communities deciding to make a difference for themselves in their communities, and also demanding to have more of a say in the future of their places. This is a photo of Northcote Golf Course during COVID, when it was opened up for public use, and it was just enormously popular. It was a bit like being in Edinburgh Gardens, actually, a very busy place. And it'll be interesting to see what happens here in terms of community action about, the use and enjoyment of this place in future. Cities are changing. There's a lot of pressure on precious open and public space. But also increasingly at the moment in the professions of planning and design, there's increasing embracing of a placemaking ethos, as people understand we need to build more sustainable cities that are healthier, more socially connected, and more equitable. And also, as we have more extreme conditions and global catastrophes like COVID and climate disasters, these sorts of things happening in our lives are also highlighting the importance of community resources and community places. So we now have things like international placemaking competitions instead of design competitions. So what does that mean? It means that, the sponsors of these kind of competitions, and this is Liverpool Waterfront, that a competition that will be launched next month, they're realising that they want communities involved from the start in the process, in sharing their knowledge, in generating ideas about not only how the place is shaped, but how it's managed, how it's enjoyed and programmed into the future. So placemaking is a community-centred way of shaping and revitalising places, in summary. The basic ethos or the principles that guide, placemaking work is that it's visionary, it's about a positive future, it's holistic, it's about our whole experience of places. It's not just about economic prosperity or social issues. It's our everyday experience through all of our senses. It's about the past, the present, and the future. It's for everybody. It's specific to the context. It's community-centred, as we said. It's action-oriented. It's about doing things as much as it is about planning things. It's very cooperative and collaborative in its processes. It's resourceful and practical because it's outcome-oriented. And it's making the best of the opportunities at hand. And it's quite an open-ended and flexible approach to creating places. So what are some positive outcomes? So just some examples, mainly from around Melbourne and locally, but also a couple from around the world. And outcomes that are about our lived experience, the impact on the ground, but also transformations for people involved in placemaking. That's communities and others who make things happen and change. So an outcome of elevated public experiences is, a really positive outcome, and this is elevated in every sense. The High Line in New York has become just a really, world acknowledged example of the transformation of a derelict railway line by the community, so championed and initiated by the community to conserve this space, or what was left of it after part of it was demolished, and transform it into essentially an elevated park. It's been enormously successful and influential, and I notice now there's just announced a couple of days ago, a similar project is being launched in London as a way of attracting people back to public spaces, including tourists. It's about, enabling participation in civic life, public participation. Federation Square, a project, as Jonathan said, I was involved in for several years. We didn't know at the beginning really how to use, what to do in these spaces. And I was speaking to a lot of people for a lot of the time. And now we've used it in ways we didn't know. We've joined together and experienced things together that we didn't really do before because we didn't have a place to do it. Shared stories. So riffing off what Emily was talking about, thinking about ways we can share stories of the past, but important stories such as, a contact between the Aurora peoples in Sydney and, and the original site of Government House. This really evocative public work by Fiona Foley, an Aboriginal artist, and Janet Lawrence. It's a sound work. It's a work that uses language to evoke the experience of the first Europeans being watched closely by traditional peoples as they landed. There's also social ways of telling stories, walking tours, and place naming is a really powerful way of telling stories about places and expressing the identity of places. Different kinds of nightlife can occur when we think about the whole experience of a place, what it's like day and night. This is the centre of a block in Hobart that's been roofed over and basically made into, it's a private space, but it's very communal. It has all sorts of activities, events, music occurring. It can be hired out, but it's a great space for the community to use at night, as well as during the day. A new mission, a community mission for heritage spaces. This is Abbotsford Convent, a well-known example of a place that was saved by the community and then gradually converted and restored to a plethora of community and creative uses. Renew Australia, helping to match vacant places, particularly retail spaces, with the needs of young entrepreneurs, social enterprises, community organisations, not-for-profit. So rent-free, a different mix of people on our faces on our streets. I think this has happened in Geelong too. Then other creative havens like Kindred Studios, a private initiated one, but very affordable studio space, working space, university space, a mix of uses for communities. Seeing subcultures thrive in public spaces, particularly public spaces perhaps not thought of as for them. This is the skate park in London under South Bank Art Centre, quite elite arts organisations there. And then you've got this skate park that's been there for now going on 30-something years, recently saved from conversion. Environmental action and education, letting communities basically restore the land. This is Ceres in Brunswick. Community-driven festivals, really expressing and attracting more and more communities, but expressing sort of really the creativity of their own communities and the regions they're in. Castlemaine Festival this is, and it's breaking out of all the traditional platforms for artistic expression and using all sorts of places and spaces for activity. Testing ideas is something that you could do with placemaking, and there's various projects around the place that are just temporarily testing activities in defunct spaces like Saxon Street site works in Brunswick, but also testing ideas for future living. This is down at Federation Square, the new project that's about a completely enclosed cycle waste, utilising waste to live in a house and produce everything that needs to live with. So it's great futuristic ideas. Also quick wins for, using spaces while development's in progress, making sure that they can be used by the community, like pop-up parks that we initiated down in Docklands while very slow development was going on down there. But also pop-ups that we've used when we've urgently needed them, such as during COVID, to enable traders to still operate, during restrictions. So there's also outcomes of process, a shared vision, working together across the community, the specialists, the developers and the agencies to agree on a vision for a place and what the community outcomes will be. Developing mutual trust and support between the different stakeholders is something that happens when we start that conversation and work together. Increasing people's appetite for change, where sometimes they might be resistant. Developing new partnerships and alliances, and also, basically increasing community sense of participation and ownership of a place. So what are some of the ways we can do placemaking? There's lots of different ways, and some of the ways that people like myself can facilitate and help others doing placemaking, both design teams, developers and communities, is a number of different ways. Traditionally, a process of development, a developer-led process, doesn't have much space for community involvement. It's often just around the time of development approvals. But really what we'd like to see is communities involved in all these yellow parts of the process and really messing up the process a bit, but opening up opportunities all the time for community contribution. So exploring the opportunities, developing that vision, developing an aspirational brief that we can agree on that involves everyone and has outcomes for everyone. Co-designing the outcomes, and then agreeing and getting partners on board, and both building the hardware but also making other things, including the programs, the temporary infrastructure, and the models for managing and caring for places. It's a cycle rather than a simple linear process that just ends. So the simple ways we can basically help placemaking is by learning about places, by looking very closely at what's going on and listening very carefully at what people, the community and the experts have to say about the place, and then collectively imagining a better future. So going out and investigating things, this is work down for North Hobart recently, talking to traders, talking to councillors, talking to the community, going into the back blocks and the back alleys to find out and see what's going on. Then sitting down and analysing and talking about the issues, and then also helping people to map in their own way what's going on, what they love about a place, what they'd like to see in future, and doing that in creative ways. Continuing to do that throughout the design process with the experts like design teams and technical experts, and keeping on getting the feedback loop with communities. And then finally, when we've got the agreed vision, really working out ways to join together and actually do the work to make the place. So what are the opportunities for Geelong with placemaking? I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Emily, as well, for two fantastic presentations. We're going to open up now for the Q&A. So if you've not already done so, please post your questions in the chat function. We are moderating the discussion to focus on questions that help us improve our understanding of urban design. But to kick things off, I'm going to ask Vanessa a question. And you can absolutely disagree with me, Vanessa. I'd say the practice of placemaking, I guess in a formal sense, is relatively new. So what's happened to our public spaces that we now need to activate them?
Well, I think what's happened and what's perhaps implicit in what I was saying is this disconnect between the processes of producing new places, particularly big public places, big venues or big pieces of infrastructure. That process is very disconnected from the people and the place itself. So often experts are coming in, they do a bit of work about, to look about what's going on the ground, but often that investigation is quite technical, it's quite siloed, so different experts aren't necessarily sharing the information. A lot of the work that we do, as placemaking facilitators and advisors is try and join the dots, bridge the gaps and facilitate the conversation so there's a cross-fertilisation, but also particularly focus on the community views. It's not all about community empowerment. A lot of it is about getting communities involved and helping them to feel that they can make change themselves in different ways, some of which I talked about there. But also it's about helping people to sort of, us also doing our own deep investigation to the culture of place. What is actually happening? What are the assets that are there? How are they being used? What are the stories that are important to tell? and then thrashing that all through to try and explore, you know, the deeper culture and identity of a place, and make sure that can go into the thinking behind the brief, really, the brief for design, and also the shaping of operations and for places. So, you know, we've done work for a number of cultural venues, for example, and, you know, really opening up minds about doing things differently to get, you know, bigger audiences and more participation in different forms of cultural and community life.
Thanks, Vanessa. So we'll go to to some questions from the audience today. The first one, I think, is a really important one. So the first question is can attachment to place be a barrier? And I think if you work in many different fields, but certainly in local government, you will experience situations quite commonly where some communities don't want to change anything about their streets or their public spaces because they have such a strong attachment to it. Whereas other people in the community still have a strong attachment, but want to change. So I don't know, Vanessa, if you want to pick that up first, and then we can go to Emily.
Sure. People do have, I've found, you know, having done countless different explorations with people about what they value about the place. It's most of the time, and one of the things about having conversations rather than just surveys and other forms of research, social research, is most of the time people have common shared interests. And yet people are one of the values of sharing, you know, in discussions and conversations publicly what's going on is that people can see other people's interests and start to change. So placemakings can, you know, those sort of processes can be quite transformative. And a number of times I've had, you know, people give feedback to me saying, you know, thanks for this and that, but also that they really had their minds opened up to other possibilities just by listening to their neighbours, to other interested parties about what was going on, what was working, what's not working, and what's happening elsewhere around the world. And the other thing is talking about the future. So once we understand the drivers of change, some of which are quite global and catastrophic, as we said, but other drivers is economic and so on, people really begin to think differently and go, okay, yes, I mean, we do need to do something. There are better ways. We can still keep what we love, but have to adapt a bit to make things better for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Emily, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Following on from Vanessa's point, I suppose what I was advocating in my talk was a necessary kind of ongoing reevaluation of what is being excluded in a space and what stories are dominating over others. And, you know, attachment to place, you could understand as somebody's desire to have their story of place be recognized, you know, to be visible, to be there as part of their kind of claim to that place. But I think if people, when I think concern for people arises around changes to their local environment or public spaces around them, it is often around that concern of erasure, that how they know that place or how they inhabit it will be gone, and they won't be able to. It won't be visible anymore. It will be denied. So I think, you know, that's that balance of continually evolving place to suit that community and its current needs, but also acknowledging its history and the diverse attachments to place that have been generated by it. And that, of course, involves multiple different means and methods of doing that. But I think that's a general principle, that if people feel they haven't been erased from place, the attachment can be more productively managed into change.
Yeah. Thanks, Emily. The next question, I think there's a bit of a thread sort of with the questions today, which is probably not surprising given the topic. The next question is related to I guess it's been called an exodus in the question. I'm not quite sure it's that significant, but obviously a lot of people have taken the opportunity and are taking the opportunity to move from the city to regional towns and smaller sort of communities, and you know, they bring with them you know, their own sense of place and their own sense of who they are. How can they establish you know, a new sense of place in a new environment where there's, you know, quite often very strong sense of you know, of a place, and yeah, how can they overcome maybe some of those challenges?
It's a great question, and it is definitely a phenomena that is happening, and the kind of the gentrification of regional areas because of people moving out of the cities, and that, you know, then brings the potential for new versions of erasure, because you might sort of have the imposition of somebody's you know, sense of place that they bring with them from an urban context, or the way in which they've lived their life. They bring to the new place and don't engage with kind of what's already there. And so it's that dance between it's, you know, what Vanessa was saying about like learning about your place. I mean, I think there's a literacy to place that we all need to be attuned to. Where are we? Whose land was this traditionally? That's a question we don't ask ourselves often enough in Australia. Who's been here before? Who made this place to bring us here today? And that's a great foundation for moving to a new place. The corollary is, of course, that new people in place can feel excluded if there isn't space left then for their own negotiation with this place. And that's where it's important that ongoing placemaking takes account of migration and new arrivals to allow their experience of place to enter into the stories told about that place. So it's a process, I think. I hope that's answered the question.
Thanks, Emily. Vanessa?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of two examples that are quite different. One being Castlemaine that I mentioned. I live in Northcote, and Castlemaine is sometimes called North Northcote because of the mass migration from Northcote to Castlemaine, apparently over the decades. And I understand that to be actually people going to a place where they think they can have a better life because they recognise what's going on there as something that they want to be part of, and that the creative community there is very much part of that, a community that's active in conservation and so on. Is that so? The shared values is what's making that tree change movement. In that case, I would say a predominant driver, and in terms of people feeling displaced or erased from that, I think that it's not happening so much because there's an openness, there's an open mindset, I guess, generally amongst that community. And of course, it's got its divisions like any community, and I'm not going to try and paraphrase or pretend to know the intricacies, but I think that kind of movement is open and in flux, and perhaps it always has been in towns like that. Other places, for example, maybe like Hobart, which is similar in size to Geelong and has some similar kind of things going on in it in terms of development and migration. There's resistance, yes, and in some quarters, and some of that is just fear of change, fear of loss, and it can nonetheless be something that has positives. And I do find the more people talk about the positives and think about the opportunities, including businesses and people who can, you know, basically now, you know, have more choices when there's a bigger population and a younger population perhaps moving in, gradually start to see the positives. And the more shared spaces and opportunities for shared life we have, I guess I'm advocating, and we do in our work, is that that's more likely to be the case. The more people see actually experiencing each other and the benefits of greater population, new communities, the more you see that change occur for the positive, break down the fear, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very challenging aspect, especially when some places experience very rapid change.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at what's happening at the moment with COVID, and I moved to the Bellarine Peninsula a year ago, and all of a sudden it's become incredibly popular, and house prices are going up at a rapid rate.
Yes.
And that's going to bring a lot of different change. It's going to bring a lot of different people with different values.
Yes.
But that's been happening forever. Ocean Grove, for example, started out as an alcohol-free settlement by a Methodist church from America. It's a long time since it's been that, but it's rapidly evolving. It seems to me place in a sense of place is not something that should be thought of as fixed or determined. It's always sort of becoming and changing.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's just my little bit on that. But
no, it's very true. And affordability is a very big issue, though. I think you're right, and that's a whole discussion in itself, and one that does often come up in placemaking work when we talk about some of those local benefits that can be regulated and not enforced but negotiated with developers. We can definitely do things in that space, like require a percentage of dwellings to be affordable. It's been done very well in the US and in Europe, for example, and there's no reason why we can't do it more here. There's a few examples, but it's all possible as part of that negotiation and approvals phase of development. So we often advocate for that.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. We've got a few more questions in the chat. So we've got one from Alana Russell. So Alana's asking, do you see placemaking as primarily infrastructure-based, or can it be achieved through dialogic exchange, ephemeral interventions, or other less tangible means? So I'm not sure if Emily or Vanessa wants to go.
You go, Emily.
I would say definitely.
Yeah, same here, for sure.
They're all forces of placemaking, and I mean, my research has been exploring a range of those. There's a Salawat Trail, but also this project I've been doing in the Mallee involving readers has been one of the things that I've done there is a series of literary walks where residents of Mildura, which is the image behind me is Mildura, walk along the Murray River reading stories from that place, but that in place. But these stories are not the conventional stories that those residents understand as belonging to the Mallee. They're multicultural. They might be from another place that has some kind of imaginative relationship to the Mallee. So it sort of expands the register by which that group of people are able to talk about their connection to place. And that is, I think, an ephemeral intervention into placemaking. It's not one that, is a structure, and it doesn't necessarily change how that next person comes along and experiences place. But I think it does form that intervention that can be cumulative.
Yeah.
Vanessa.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think some of the examples I gave were temporary, or maybe I didn't explain them well enough, but definitely the conversation, as I like to call it, is probably the most powerful form of change and community making. It doesn't necessarily have to involve the hardware. It can be about changing minds and galvanizing, thinking and working together for future outcomes. So that work may all really be transient, and it may be about changing the way a place is managed, changing who manages it, all those sorts of things that, you know, we often advocate for, change, regular change in governance and transparency in governance and all those sorts of things that, you know, are very important actually to people's sense of being involved and having a say and having some ownership. So definitely.
Thanks, Vanessa. I've got a question from Megan Haney. So Megan's asking about the hard dollars. What's the economic benefit from placemaking? And she has directed it at Emily. She's asking about the silo art trail, but I'm gonna let Emily answer that specific, but also open it up more broadly about the economic benefits as well.
Oh, thank you. So unfortunately, the exact figures are in confidence with Creative Victoria. I can't share them, but I can share that there is definitely an empirically observed economic flow on that's been tracked, and that's discernible in the infrastructure that's been built in the region or that's reopened in the region, and tourist dollars are flowing through. I could also say it's not, I think, as much yet as was hoped, but that speaks potentially to the fact that the Silo Art Trail wasn't really established as a strong economic development tool. It was established as a kind of a creative intervention into these communities that could be then that became a kind of tourist draw card and so forth. So that tells us something too about how strategies around placemaking can be to a greater or lesser extent tied to economic development imperatives.
Thanks, Emily. Vanessa, do you want to maybe respond to the broader question about economic benefit?
Sure. I mean, there's lots of ways that communities and places can benefit economically from placemaking. I mean, for example, a festival obviously brings in thousands and hundreds of thousands of tourist and visitor dollars. It also costs a bit to put on, but it really relatively ends up being, when people come and stay in a place, those overnight stays, and so on, the ripple effect is a significant economic benefit. Footfall in a street when there's more comfortable, more comfortable streets to move around in, where there's places to rest. That foot traffic generates trade and business, and in fact, foot traffic creates a lot more trade than cars being able to park in front of shops and that whole thing. So there's that any sort of destination is going to generate. It's going to attract people, which in turn has a potential economic flow-on effect. Jobs is another obvious one, where when people can thrive in a place because, for example, they're not being pushed out, the rents aren't still too high, social and community organisations can also have offices on the street as well as shops. That mix of the traditional village, if you like, when that's still working in a way and has the small fine grain, and people can keep their jobs and businesses, that has a local economic benefit that's very significant, because it's also attached to the social benefits of those social connections, with having put down roots and all the other cultural benefits of that. So they're just a few of the economic benefits.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. We might have time for one more question. I think this is a really good question to finish on. I'm going to take a little bit of license and edit it slightly. So the question is, does a strong sense of place mean that a particular community is more or less resilient? You'd like to go first?
I might jump in first. I think it depends on, it comes back to that question around attachment. I think if it's a strong sense of place that potentially excludes other senses of place or other modes of attachment, then it doesn't lend itself to resilience, I think, for that community. But if it's a strong sense of place that opens itself up to diversity of attachments, then yes, I think it has that potential.
Is that when you say that, you mean if a community has a confidence in itself, it can then be more open to
yeah, a confidence in itself. And I mean, if I could just quickly allude to one of the questions that was asked earlier, I saw around Massacre Bay, and what that was a question around, you know, that's a name that people don't like, and how do you tell that history without upsetting a lot of people? And I think what the connection I'm trying to draw is that there perhaps you could bring in other stories of Indigenous settler relations too. You could find in the history of that place stories of connection and positive contact as well that would have happened subsequently or around the horrors of that violence. So, and being able to tell that bad story, for want of a better word, with a positive one, I think enables that strength to grow. You're not just excluding the bad one for want of the good one, in a way.
Thanks, Emily. Vanessa?
I think I think it can. I think it's probably, I find it more useful to talk about a sense of belonging when we talk about resilience, because that's the relationships between people. And some of those relationships extend to their connections or their emotions about things in the place, but really the connections between people, between neighbours, families, and, you know, long-standing residents is what's going to pull people through times of difficulty. You know, just looking at what's happened through the bushfires and in places like Malakuta, you know, that they are strong communities that are well connected. People are staying there. They're going, you know, they helped each other through it. And I mean, I don't know the statistics, but it's that kind of situation where you see it's the relationships, those emotional bonds between people that is what's going to help us survive crises, but also adapt and change and prepare for them together, so that we can work together to respond.
Thanks, Vanessa. Well, I think we're all out of questions at this point, which is good because we're almost out of time. I want to thank both Emily and Vanessa for the talks and for the discussion. And you know, it's, you know, in these webinars we're really just scratching the surface of some very big and important topics. And you've both done really well, I think, to communicate a lot of really important information in a very concise way today. But obviously there's a lot there that I hope everyone that's watching will go off and do a bit of their own research and explore in a lot more detail. If we didn't get to answer any of your questions today, please have a look at the Revitalising Central Geelong web page. There's details on there about current projects, and that we put a link in the chat. And I want to thank you all again for joining us.